This homeless girl was kicked out of a construction site by an employee of a very rich man. But when the millionaire finds out, something unbelievable happens. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to the channel to support my work. The rain poured mercilessly over Manhattan that June morning, turning the downtown streets into small rivers. Alaric Ventura watched the gray landscape through the tinted glass of his Cadillac Escalade, strategically parked in front of his newest construction project. The 20-story office building was just another in his vast portfolio of developments. But something compelled him to visit it personally that day. At 54, Alaric carried on his weathered face the scars of a life few knew about. His impeccable Italian suit and gold watch contrasted sharply with the memories that haunted him, of a barefoot boy carrying buckets of cement under the scorching sun. A sudden movement caught his eye. A small figure darted across the sidewalk, seeking shelter from the rain under the construction site's awning. It was a girl, no older than 6. Her soaked clothes clung to her thin body, her dark hair dripping onto her pale, frightened face. Before Alaric could process the scene, his construction site supervisor, Tony Barbieri, emerged from the guard shack like an enraged bull. "Get out of here, you little pest! This ain't no place for beggars!" The man's deep voice echoed through the street as he advanced toward the girl. The child, paralyzed by fear, could only tremble, her large eyes fixed on the man who was approaching. Menacingly, Tony grabbed the girl's thin arm with disproportionate force, dragging her into the rain. Something inside Alaric snapped. The present and the past merged into a single image. The frightened girl transformed into another figure, his mother, Helen, being brutally pushed against the wall by his drunken father. The same look of terror, the same helplessness. Without thinking, Alaric opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. "Let her go, now!" His voice, normally controlled, came out like thunder. Tony froze, instantly recognizing his boss. "Mr. Ventura, these people can't be here. They disrupt the work," Tony stammered, still holding the girl's arm. "I said let her go." Alaric approached, his imposing presence causing Tony to back away. The girl, freed from the brutal grip, remained where she was, like a cornered animal. "You're fired, Tony. Gather your things and get off my sight. Now!" Tony's face contorted into a mask of hatred and disbelief. "You can't do this. Not because of this. I can, and I am. Leave before I call the cops." Tony took a step. Forward. His finger pointed at Alaric's chest. "You'll regret this. You think I don't know things about the shady deals in the beginning of the company? How you got your first contracts?" Alaric felt the blood run cold in his veins, but maintained his firm stance. "Are you threatening me, Tony?" "No, Mr. Ventura. I'm promising." Tony spat the words before turning his back and leaving a heavy silence in the air. The rain continued to fall, but Alaric barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the girl, who was still trembling, now not only from cold, but from fear. Something in that look touched him deeply, as if he were facing a mirror of the past. Slowly, so as not to scare her even more, Alaric approached and crouched down, getting to her level. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, her eyes darting between Alaric and the street, as if assessing an escape route. "Liv," she finally replied, in an almost inaudible whisper. "Liv, are you alone? Where's your mother?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. "She went to heaven," she murmured, hugging her own body tightly. Alaric felt something squeeze his heart. An orphan, as he once was, alone in the streets, as he could have been if fate had been a little more cruel. "Come with me," the words came out of his mouth before he could think. "I'll take you to a safe place where you can dry off and eat something." Liv took a step back, distrustful. Alaric understood her fear. "The street teaches you not to trust anyone. I promise no one will hurt you. You can leave whenever you want." For a long moment, Liv just stared at him, as if trying to read his soul through his eyes. Finally, in a gesture that surprised even Alaric, she extended her small hand towards him. As they walked to the car, Alaric could not imagine that this simple act of compassion was about to unleash a storm in his life, one that would bring to light long-buried secrets and change his destiny forever. The Ventura mansion stood imposingly in the wealthiest neighborhood of Manhattan, its marble walls and mirrored windows reflecting the rain that was still falling. For Alaric, that huge house had always been more of a prison than a home, a monument to his loneliness. Now, watching Liv huddled in the back seat of the car, he realized that he might not be the only prisoner of cruel circumstances. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked for him for over 2 decades, widened her eyes when she saw him enter carrying the soaked girl. Liv clung to his neck like a small, frightened animal, leaving water stains on his Italian suit. "Good heavens, Mr. Ventura! What happened?" "Prepare a hot bath and set out some clean clothes," he ordered, ignoring the employee's astonishment. "And get her something to eat." As Maria hurried upstairs, Alaric felt the weight of the consequences of his impulsive decision. What was he doing? He couldn't just bring a street child into his house. There were protocols, laws. But feeling the tremor of the small body in his arms, he knew he couldn't have done otherwise. After the bath and dressed in clean clothes, Magate, still too big for her petite frame, Liv looked like a different child. Her dark hair, now clean and combed, framed a face that, free of dirt, revealed delicate features that reminded him of someone Alaric couldn't quite place. In the kitchen, the girl devoured the bowl of soup that Maria prepared as if she hadn't eaten in days, and probably hadn't. Alaric watched her in silence, lost in somber thoughts about his own past. "Where did you live?" he finally asked, trying to keep his voice soft so as not to scare her. The girl lowered the spoon, her eyes filling with tears again. "With my mum. We slept on an old mattress near the church. But then she got sick, very sick." Her voice faltered. Alaric felt a lump in his throat. "And there was no one else? No relatives?" Liv shook her head. "Mum said my dad died before I was born, and that my grandpa—" She stopped, biting her lip as if she had said something she shouldn't have. "Your grandfather. He was a bad man," she whispered. "Mom cried when she talked about him, said he abandoned us." Alaric's heart clenched. How many stories like that existed on the streets of the city? How many children carried the weight of adults' mistakes? The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his lawyer, Robert. "Alaric, we have a problem." The voice on the other end sounded tense. "Tony Barbieri just left my office. He's threatening to go to the press with some stories about the construction company's past." Alaric closed his eyes, feeling a wave of nausea. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that can destroy everything you've built." "He has documents, Alaric, about the first contracts, about the bidding wars in the early days of the company. That was over 20 years ago, Robert. Time doesn't erase certain things. You know that better than anyone." After hanging up, Alaric remained still, staring into space. His empire, built with so much sacrifice, threatened by ghosts, he thought. He had buried long ago. A noise brought him back to reality. Liv was standing in the kitchen doorway, hugging herself, looking even smaller in the borrowed clothes. "I need to go," she said softly. "The social worker always said we can't trust strangers." Alaric felt something cold pierce his chest. Social services. Of course, they should be looking for her. "Wait," he asked, standing up. "You can't go back to the streets. It's dangerous." "But I don't want to go to the shelter." Tears returned to her eyes. "It's horrible there. The other kids are mean to me." At that moment, looking at that small, frightened figure, Alaric made another impulsive decision, the second of the day. "You can stay here," he said, "at least for now." Liv's eyes widened. "Really?" Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. Maria appeared in the kitchen, her face pale. "Sir, there's a social worker at the door. She said she received a report about a minor in an irregular situation." Blood ran cold in Alaric's veins. Tony, it had to be him. Liv grabbed Alaric's hand tightly. "Please don't let them take me," she pleaded in a whisper. Alaric squeezed her small hand back, feeling the tremor that ran through the girl's body. How could he protect her when his own world was about to collapse? The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. The sound echoed through the empty house like a harbinger of doom. "Maria!" he called, his voice taking on a tone of urgency. "Take Liv through the back to the pool house. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone until I call." As he watched Maria guide Liv out of the kitchen, Alaric straightened his shoulders and walked towards the front door. His heart was pounding, but his expression was one of pure determination. He would not allow them to take that child, not when something inside him screamed that he needed to protect her, that there was a greater reason for their paths to have crossed on that rainy morning, even if it meant facing not only social services, but also the ghosts of his own past. Irene Dwyer was standing at the door of the mansion, her rigid posture and piercing gaze making her authority clear. At 45, she had seen it all in her career as a social worker, and something about that situation set off all her internal alarms. "Mr. Ventura," her voice was firm and professional, "I'm from Child Protective Services. We received a report about a minor in an irregular situation at your residence." Alaric maintained his composure. Years of difficult negotiations had prepared him for moments like this. "Come in, please," he said, leading her to the living room. The luxurious environment did not seem to impress Irene. She sat on the edge of the sofa, folder of documents in her lap, watching Alaric with analytical eyes. "Mr. Ventura, I'll be direct. Are you aware that harboring a minor without legal authorization is a crime?" "I'm just offering humanitarian aid to a child in need," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "I couldn't leave her in the rain." "Noble of you." Irene's tone was almost ironic. "But there are legal procedures for these situations. You should have contacted the competent authorities immediately." Alaric felt a stab of irritation. So she could be thrown into an overcrowded shelter? Just another statistic in the system? "The system exists for a reason, Mr. Ventura." Irene opened her folder, removing some papers. "Besides, since we're talking about the system, I did a quick search on you on the way here. Your record isn't exactly spotless." Alaric's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "Some allegations of bribery and bidding processes early in your career. The cases were dismissed for lack of evidence, but—" She paused significantly. "It raises questions about your suitability to care for a minor." At that moment, a noise coming from the kitchen caught both their attention. Maria appeared at the door, her face pale. "Sir, the girl. She's gone." Alaric jumped up. "What? Do you mean gone? Weren't you with her in the pool house? She said she needed to use the bathroom when I went back to get her." Maria wrung her hands, nervous. Irene also got up, her expression hardening even further. "This is unacceptable. I'm calling the police immediately." "No!" Alaric practically shouted. "Please, give me a few hours. She must be scared, but she can't have gone far." "Mr. Ventura, you're not in a position to make demands. A missing child is an extremely serious matter." Before Alaric could answer, another sound caught their attention. It came from upstairs, a small thud like something falling. Without saying a word, he ran upstairs, closely followed by Irene. The sound led them to his office, where the door was ajar. Liv was there, standing in the middle of the room, holding a photograph that had fallen from one of the shelves. Her small face was streaked with tears. "Liv?" Alaric began, but stopped when he saw her expression. "It's my mum," she said, turning the photo so he could see it. "Why do you have a picture of my mum?" Alaric felt the world spin as he looked at the image. It was an old photo from over 20 years ago. It showed a smiling young woman next to a group of construction workers at a construction site. His heart raced as he recognized the face. It was impossibly similar to Liv. What was your mother's name?" His voice came out shaky. "Luana," Liv replied. "Luana Oliveira." The name hit Alaric like a punch to the gut. Luana. Heloise's daughter, Heloise Oliveira, the construction worker he had a brief relationship with in the beginning of his career. The woman he abandoned when... Mr. Ventura. Irene's voice brought him back to reality. "Did you know her mother?" Alaric could barely breathe. Long-buried memories began to surface. Heloise trying to talk to him, being barred at the construction company's gate. His father saying she was trying to scam him. The medical exams that proved his infertility. He looked at Liv, who was still holding the photo with her small hands. "I knew your grandmother, Heloise." Liv's eyes widened. "Grandma, Heloise. Mom talked about her sometimes. Said she died when I was a baby." Irene watched the scene with growing interest. "Mr. Ventura, I think you have some explaining to do." But Alaric barely heard her. His mind was making frantic calculations. If Luana was Heloise's daughter, if the dates matched, if the exams were fake. "Your mother's documents," he addressed Liv, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you have anything of hers? Anything at all?" Liv hesitated for a moment, then reached into the pocket of the borrowed dress. She pulled out a folded and crumpled piece of paper. It looked like a page torn from a notebook. "Just this," she said softly. "Mom wrote it before she went to heaven." With trembling hands, Alaric took the paper. The handwriting was uneven, as if it had been written in haste or with difficulty. "My dearest Liv, there's so much I wanted to tell you. About your grandfather, about the past. But now it's too late. I just want you to know that he wasn't the monster I said he was. I was angry, hurt. Alaric Ventura never knew he was my father. Grandma never told him, and I kept that secret out of pride. Forgive me, my daughter. Forgive me for filling your heart with hatred for someone who, despite his mistakes, never knew the truth." The paper slipped from Alaric's hands, floating to the floor like a dead leaf. The silence that followed was deafening. Liv looked at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. "What does this mean?" But Alaric couldn't answer. The weight of the truth crushed him, stealing his air, his voice, his ability to think. All this time he had a daughter, and now a granddaughter, and both lived on the streets, in need, while he lived in his empty mansion. "I think," Irene's voice cut through the silence like a blade, "that we need to have a very serious conversation. All of us." Alaric's office, once a haven of silence and order, now seemed too small to contain the weight of the revelations. Irene had insisted that everyone sit down, her authoritative presence maintaining a fragile control over the situation. Maria brought tea, her hands trembling so much that the cups clinked on the tray. Liv huddled in an armchair too big for her size, still holding the photo of her mother. Her eyes, already red from crying, alternated between Alaric and the paper fallen on the floor. Luana's last message, a time bomb of long-hidden truths. "We need to establish some facts," Irene began, her professional tone barely disguising her own bewilderment at the situation. "Mr. Ventura, are you claiming to be this child's biological grandfather?" Alaric, who had not yet fully recovered from the shock, ran his hands over his tired face. I didn't know. All these years, I didn't know." "That doesn't answer my question," Irene insisted. "Yes," he replied finally, his voice laden with an old pain. "Heloise Oliveira worked on one of my construction sites early in the company. We got involved. But I was led to believe that I was sterile. My father, he manipulated medical exams, said Heloise was trying to scam me. Liv raised her eyes from the photo, her small voice cutting through the air like a knife. Mom said Grandpa was a bad man, that he left her and Grandma alone. The words hit Alaric like a slap. I never knew Liv. If I had known... His voice faltered. What would you have done? Irene's question was as sharp as a razor. Your record shows a questionable history, Mr. Ventura. Bribes, dubious contracts. I was young. Alaric stood up abruptly, startling Liv. Realizing his mistake, he forced himself to calm down. I was young and desperate to prove myself. My father, he was a violent man, drank a lot, beat my mother. I grew up promising myself that I would be different, that I would build something I could be proud of. And to do that, you disregarded ethical principles. I'm not proud of the choices I made, but everything I built afterwards, every building, every project, was honest. I tried to make up for the mistakes of the past. A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the rain had started again, beating against the windows like a persistent reminder of the day that had changed everything. Mr. Ventura, Irene adjusted her glasses, consulting some notes. Do you understand that, even as the alleged biological grandfather, you have no legal rights over Liv at the moment? We would need DNA tests, custody proceedings. I don't want to leave. Liv's voice surprised everyone. She had left the photo in her lap and was now hugging her knees. I don't want to go back to the shelter. Honey, Irene softened her tone when addressing the girl. There are procedures we need to follow for your own safety. At that moment, Maria rushed into the office, her normally serene face contorted with worry. Mr. Alaric, there's a news crew in front of the house. They're saying something about allegations of corruption. Alaric closed his eyes, feeling the world collapse around him. Tony, he had made good on his threat. Maria, his voice came out firmer than he expected. Lock all the gates. Don't let anyone in. Irene stood up, her expression more severe than ever. This is very convenient, isn't it? Just when we discover this family connection, allegations against you surface. It's not what you think, Alaric tried to explain, but was interrupted by the sound of his cell phone. It was Robert, his lawyer. Alaric, turn on the TV, now. With trembling hands, Alaric picked up the remote and turned on the television built into the wall of the office. Tony Barbieri's face filled the screen, his expression vengeful as he spoke to the reporter. I have proof that Alaric Ventura built his empire through bribes and fraudulent contracts. And now, to clean up his image, he kidnapped a street child. That's a lie, Liv shouted at the TV, surprising everyone again. He saved me. The bad man at the construction site wanted to hurt me. Irene watched everything with critical eyes. Mr. Ventura, this situation is getting more and more complicated. I can't leave Liv here while you're under investigation. Please, Alaric's voice was almost a plea. She's all I have left, my only family. A family you didn't even know existed until today, Irene retorted. The noise from the reporters outside increased. Camera flashes lit up the windows like lightning. The empire that Alaric had built over decades was about to crumble, and with it, the chance to finally have a family. That's when Liv got up from her armchair. With steps that were determined for someone so small, she walked to Alaric and took his hand. Mom always said we need to forgive, she said, her voice trembling slightly. That holding on to anger only hurts ourselves. Alaric felt warm tears streaming down his face. In over 40 years since his mother's death, he hadn't cried. Now, before this little child who carried the wisdom of a life too difficult for her age, the barriers he had built over the years collapsed. Ms. Dwyer, Liv turned to the social worker, still holding Alaric's hand. Please, he's my grandpa, and I don't want to be alone anymore." Irene's gaze shifted between the girl and the man. Outside, the storm of flashes and voices continued, but inside the office, time seemed to have stopped. "I'm going to make a proposal," Irene finally said. "I can get a temporary guardianship while we investigate everything appropriately. But you will have to cooperate completely, Mr. Ventura, with the investigations, with the DNA tests, with everything." "Anything," Alaric replied immediately. "I'll do anything." "And what about the allegations of corruption?" Alaric looked at Liv, who was still holding his hand as if her life depended on it. He thought of his mother, of Heloise, of Luana, 3 generations of women who suffered because of the mistakes of the men in their lives. "I'm going to face everything," he finally said. "I'm not going to run from the past anymore." That's when a deafening sound of breaking glass came from downstairs, followed by screams. Maria ran up the stairs. "Sir, they broke into the house, the reporters, and there are other people. They look like investigators." Chaos erupted in the Ventura mansion. The sound of footsteps and voices echoed through the hallways as reporters and investigators invaded the space that, until a few hours ago, was a sanctuary of silence and order. Alaric felt Liv cling to his hand even tighter, her small body trembling with fear. "Maria," he called, keeping his voice controlled despite the growing panic. "Take Liv to my room. Use the passage from the library." The housekeeper nodded, understanding immediately. Years ago, when he renovated the mansion, Alaric had installed a secret passage that connected the library to the master bedroom, a precaution that at the time seemed excessive, but that now proved providential. "No!" Liv clung even tighter. To him. "I don't want to be alone again." The despair in her voice broke Alaric's heart. Crouching down to get to her eye level, he held her small shoulders gently. "Liv, listen, I promise I won't let anything bad happen to you, but I need to take care of some things first. Trust me." The girl hesitated, her large eyes filled with fear and doubt. It was Irene who surprised everyone, crouching down next to Alaric. "I'll go with you, Liv," she said, her professional tone softened by an unexpected gentleness. "To make sure everything's okay." Before anyone could answer, the office door burst open. A group of men in suits entered, followed by a horde of reporters with cameras and microphones. At the front of everyone was Tony Barbieri, a smile of triumph on his face. "Where's the girl?" demanded one of the men, flashing a badge. "We have reports of kidnapping and—" "I'm Irene Dwyer, from Child Protective Services," interrupted the social worker, standing up with authority. "The minor is under my supervision at this time." The man hesitated, clearly not expecting to find an official representative on the scene. Tony, however, was not intimidated. "Ventura kidnapped this child," he shouted at the cameras, "and I have proof of all his crimes, years of corruption, bribes." "Enough," Alaric's voice thundered through the office. "You want proof, Tony? How about we start with the documents you forged to inflate construction materials?" It was Tony's turn to turn pale. "What are you talking about?" Alaric walked to his desk, opening a drawer with a key he always carried with him. "I know about all your schemes, Tony. Every altered invoice, every phantom delivery. I kept everything documented, hoping you would redeem yourself. But now, you're bluffing." Tony took a step forward, but his voice betrayed his insecurity. "Mr. Ventura," called Robert, his lawyer, who had just arrived, pushing his way through the reporters. "Don't say anything more without my presence." But Alaric had already made his decision. Years of carrying the weight of secrets and lies had taken their toll. Now, looking at Liv, the granddaughter that fate had brought him in such an unexpected way, he knew it was time to clear his conscience. "Yes, I made mistakes in the past," he said, his voice loud enough to be picked up by all the microphones. "In the early days of the construction company, I participated in bidding schemes. I was desperate to grow, to prove myself. I'm not proud of it." A murmur ran through the room. The cameras moved even closer, eager to capture every word of the powerful businessman's confession. "But in the last 20 years, I have worked to build an ethical company. Every contract, every project—" He paused, swallowing hard. "And yet, I failed the most important people. I wasn't there when my daughter needed me. I didn't even know she existed." "Daughter?" Tony frowned, confused. "What story is this?" That's when Liv, who until then had been partially hidden behind Irene, took a step forward. Her small face was streaked with tears, but there was a surprising determination in her eyes. "My mum," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she raised the photo she was still holding. "His daughter, and you," she pointed at Tony, "you wanted to hurt me this morning." The reporters immediately turned their cameras to the little girl, but Irene quickly stepped in front of her. "That's enough," declared the social worker. "This child is not a spectacle for your headlines. Gentlemen," she addressed the investigators, "I suggest we schedule a proper meeting to discuss all these issues, with the presence of the lawyers and proper legal representatives." The man with the badge nodded, seeming relieved to have a professional way out of the chaotic situation. But Tony wasn't ready to give up. "This is all a farce," he shouted, advancing towards Alaric. "You set all this up, this ridiculous lost daughter story." He didn't finish the sentence. The moment he took another step, he tripped on the rug and lost his balance. As he fell, he tried to grab onto the nearest bookshelf, knocking down a series of folders and documents. Among the papers that scattered across the floor, a small wooden box opened. Its contents spilled out like macabre confetti, old photos, yellowed letters, and a brown envelope with the letterhead of a medical laboratory. Alaric felt the blood run cold in his veins as he recognized that envelope. It was the exam that his father had manipulated, proving his infertility, the secret that had destroyed not only his life, but the lives of 3 generations of women. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were fixed on the scattered documents, on the photos that showed a young Eloise, on the envelope that held a lie with devastating consequences. It was Liv who broke the silence, her small voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. "Mum always said the truth is like water. It may take a while, but it always finds a way." At that moment, looking at his granddaughter, Alaric knew there was no turning back. It was time to let the water of truth flow, no matter how painful the process. The hours that followed the chaos in the office were a blur of depositions, signed documents, and promises made. The reporters finally left the mansion, but the silence that settled was even heavier than the previous turmoil. Alaric found himself sitting in his favorite armchair in the library, a glass of untouched water in front of him. He didn't drink alcohol, a vow he had made after seeing his father destroy the family because of drinking. Irene had obtained an emergency temporary guardianship for Liv to stay with him under her direct supervision. The girl was now sleeping in the room that Maria had hastily prepared, exhausted after the whirlwind of emotions of the day. "Do you realize the seriousness of the situation?" The voice of Robert, his lawyer, cut through the silence of the library. "Tony's accusations are serious, and your public confession didn't help at all." "What did you want me to do, Robert?" "Keep lying? I wanted you to wait. We could have managed this more strategically. Now—" He consulted his tablet, frowning. "The company's stock has already fallen 15% today alone. Investors are panicked." Alaric closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades of decisions, good and bad, on his shoulders. How much? How much what? How much will it cost to resolve this, to ensure that Liv stays with me? Robert adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "It's not that simple, Alaric. It's not just a matter of money. Tony has presented compromising documents, and more people involved are emerging from the shadows. As if to confirm his words, Alaric's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number with an attached photo that made his blood run cold. Himself, 20 years younger, shaking hands with a well-known politician in a discreet restaurant. "They're emerging like vultures," he murmured, passing the cell phone to Robert. "This is just the beginning," the lawyer sighed. "People you hurt, people who helped with the schemes. Everyone will want their share now that you're vulnerable." A soft sound at the door interrupted the conversation. It was Maria, her normally serene face marked by worry. "Sir, the girl is having nightmares. She's calling for her mother." Alaric stood up immediately, but Robert grabbed his arm. "We need to finish this conversation. The future of the company is at stake." "The company can wait." Alaric shrugged him off, already walking towards the door. "My granddaughter can't." The room that Maria had prepared for Liv was the closest to his. Still, it seemed cold and impersonal, a painful reminder of how his house had never been prepared to receive a child. Liv was curled up in the large bed, her small body shaking with sobs. When Alaric entered, she raised her head, her eyes red and scared. "Sorry," she murmured. "I didn't want to bother you." "You never bother me." He sat on the edge of the bed, his heart aching as he saw how she cowered, as if expecting to be scolded. How many nights had she spent like this, alone, with her fears? "Do you want to tell me about the nightmare?" Livy hesitated, playing with the hem of the borrowed pajamas, still too big for her. "It was about Mom, when she got sick." Alaric felt a lump in his throat. How was it?" She coughed a lot. She had a fever. Tears began to stream down her little face again. "I asked people to help, but no one stopped. No one looked at us." Alaric closed his eyes, imagining his daughter, the daughter he never knew, dying, little by little on some sidewalk, while he lived comfortably in his mansion. "One day," Liv continued, her small voice choked with sobs, "she didn't wake up. I kept calling, but she didn't wake up." Without thinking twice, Alaric pulled her into his arms. Liv initially stiffened at the contact, but soon surrendered. To the embrace, crying against his chest. "Forgive me," he murmured, his own eyes tearing up. "Forgive me for not having been there." They stayed like that for a long time, until Liv's sobs subsided. When she finally calmed down, Alaric noticed that she was still holding something tightly, a piece of old, faded fabric. "What's this?" It was Mom's. Liv showed what looked like a handkerchief. "She always slept with it. She said it was special." Alaric took the handkerchief carefully, and his heart almost stopped. In the corner, hand-embroidered with faded blue thread, were the initials H.O., Heloise Oliveira. "I gave this to your grandmother." His voice came out shaky. "The day we met, she had hurt herself at the construction site, cut her hand. I offered my handkerchief to stop the blood." Liv looked at him with wide eyes. "Really?" "Yes, she tried to give it back to me later, but I insisted she keep it." He smiled sadly. "I never imagined it would get to you." A noise coming from the hallway caught both their attention. Robert was standing at the door, his face a mask of worry. "Alaric, we need to resolve this now. The press is preparing a bombshell story for tomorrow. They're going to expose everything." "Are you going to have to leave?" Liv's voice was full of fear. "Like everyone else?" "No," Alaric replied firmly, still holding the handkerchief. "I'm not going anywhere. Never again." "But the company," Robert began. "The company is just a bunch of buildings and papers," Alaric interrupted him. "I've already lost one family because of lies and ambition. I'm not going to lose another." At that moment, his cell phone vibrated again. More messages, more veiled. Threats, more people wanting a slice of the empire that was beginning to crumble. But for the first time in his life, Alaric didn't feel fear. Looking at Liv, who was still holding her grandmother's handkerchief as if it were a precious treasure, He knew exactly what he needed to do. "Robert!" he called, his voice taking on the decisive tone that had taken him to the top of the business world. "Prepare the documents. I'm going to transfer everything." "Transfer everything what?" "The company, the assets. I want to create a trust fund in Liv's name." He paused, looking into his granddaughter's frightened eyes. "It's time for this fortune to serve its true purpose, to ensure that you have the life that your mother and grandmother should have had." But it's everything you have," Robert protested. "No," Alaric smiled, hugging Liv tighter. "It's not everything. Now I have something much more valuable." Outside, the Manhattan night continued its usual symphony of horns and sirens. But inside that room something was changing. Like water finding its way, as Liv had said, the truth was finally flowing. And with it, the chance for redemption that Alaric didn't even know he was seeking. The morning arrived relentlessly, bringing with it the headlines that Robert had predicted. The story of Alaric Ventura blazed across the front page of every newspaper, each one more sensational than the other. His public confession had opened a Pandora's box that now seemed impossible to close. Maria served breakfast in the dining room, a meal that for years had been a solitary ritual and now had a new participant. Liv, still wearing borrowed clothes that desperately needed to be adjusted, looked with fascination at the amount of food on the table. "You can eat whatever you want," Alaric said softly, noticing how she hesitated before each item. "All of this is yours too." Liv picked up a piece of toast carefully, as if afraid someone was going to take it from her. "We used to get stale bread at the bakery," she commented quietly. "When the nice guy was working, he would give us the leftovers from the day before." Each small revelation about the life his daughter and granddaughter had led was like a stab in Alaric's heart, as he watched Liv eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it were her last. His cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating with calls and messages. "Sir," Maria approached discreetly, "the social worker is here, and there are more reporters in front of the house." Alaric nodded, already expecting it. "Liv, honey, finish your breakfast. Maria will take you to choose some new clothes in a room while I talk to Miss Dwyer, okay?" To his surprise, Liv dropped the toast immediately, her eyes wide with fear. "You promised you weren't going to send me away." "And I'm not," he hastened to assure her, kneeling beside her. "Never. But we need to do everything right, follow the rules, so that no one can separate us. Do you trust me?" Liv hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. But before following Maria, she took something out of the pocket of the dress, Heloise's old handkerchief, and held it out to Alaric. "So you don't forget the promise," she said, with a seriousness that broke his heart. Alaric took the handkerchief with trembling hands, feeling the worn fabric between his fingers, a piece of his history that had survived through 3 generations, to come back to him. Irene was waiting in the library, her folder of documents even fuller than the day before. Her normally stern face looked especially tense this morning. "Did you see the papers?" she asked without preamble. "I didn't need to," Alaric replied, still holding the handkerchief. "The messages and calls won't stop." "Mr. Ventura, I'm going. To be direct, your situation is extremely complicated. The allegations of corruption are serious. There's a formal investigation being opened. Under normal circumstances, that would be more than enough reason to deny any custody request." Alaric felt his heart clench. But... Irene adjusted her glasses. A gesture that he had already noticed was a sign that she was thinking carefully about her next words. "There's something different about this case. First, the biological connection, which still needs to be confirmed with DNA tests, of course. Second, Liv herself. In all my years of practice, I've never seen a child in a street situation adapt so quickly to a new environment. She's special," Alaric said softly, Yes, she is, and also extremely resilient. But you know what impresses me most? The fact that despite all the chaos that's happening, her first and only concern has been her well-being. Before Alaric could respond, the library door opened. It was Robert, his normally composed face now marked by a worrying pallor. "Alaric, we have a serious problem. The police are on their way, with a search warrant." "What? Why?" "Tony," he presented, "documents that suggest you still maintain records of all the old schemes, including—" Robert hesitated, casting a meaningful glance at Irene. "Including what?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Alleged proof that Mr. Ventura knew about the existence of his daughter all along, and that he abandoned her on purpose to avoid a scandal that could harm the company at the time." Alaric felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. "That's a lie, I never—" "You're the lie!" The shout came from the library door. Liv was there, tears streaming down her small face. Maria was right behind her, looking mortified for not having been able to prevent her from overhearing the conversation. "Liv, it's not what you think." Alaric took a step towards her, but she recoiled. "Mom was right. You're evil. You knew about us and didn't want to help." She snatched the handkerchief from his hands forcefully. "This doesn't mean anything, nothing." "Liv, please." But she had already run out, her small steps echoing down the hall. Maria went after her immediately, calling her name. "Well?" Irene stood up, her face more closed off than ever. "I think this changes things considerably." "No! You don't understand. This is a setup by Tony. He's trying to destroy me." "And why would he do that?" "Because—" Alaric stopped, realizing the trap he had fallen into. If he told the truth about Tony, about the schemes he himself had discovered, he would be admitting that he kept evidence of illicit activities. If he denied it, it would seem that he was hiding something even worse. The sound of sirens in the distance announced that his time was running out. Somewhere in the house, he could hear Liv crying, a sound that tore at his soul. "Mr. Ventura," Irene said, her voice now carrying a note of something close to pity. "I'm sorry, but I can't ignore these accusations. Until everything is properly investigated, Liv will have to go to a temporary shelter." "No!" The word came out as a desperate whisper. "Please, she's all I have left, and that's exactly why I need to protect her, even from you if necessary." The sirens were closer now. Robert frantically consulted his cell phone, probably trying to find some legal way out of the situation. But Alaric barely heard him. In his mind, he saw the faces of his mother, of Heloise, of Luana, and now of Liv. 4 generations of women marked by the pain of his decisions. That's when a scream from Maria cut through the air, coming from upstairs. "Mr. Alaric, Liv, she's gone." Panic took over the Ventura mansion. Maria stumbled down the stairs, her normally composed face now marked by despair. "She's not anywhere. I looked in all the rooms, in the bathrooms." Alaric felt his heart beating so hard it felt like it wanted to jump out of his chest. In his mind, thousands of terrible scenarios unfolded. Liv, alone on the streets again, vulnerable, scared. "The windows!" he shouted suddenly. "Maria, check if any window is open." The housekeeper ran back upstairs, while Irene was already on the phone, alerting authorities. Robert, in turn, tried to organize the situation with the police who arrived for the search. "Sir," Maria's voice echoed from the upper hallway, "the window in the guest room. There's a tree next to it." Alaric didn't wait for her to finish. He ran up the stairs 2 at a time, his body protesting against the sudden effort. In the room, the open window let in the cool morning breeze, the curtains swaying gently. The large oak tree in the garden had a branch that reached close to the window, close enough for a small, desperate child to reach. "My God," he whispered, imagining Liv risking herself at that height. If she had fallen— "Mr. Ventura," Irene called him from the door. I've already alerted the police and child protective services. They're going to start the search immediately. No, he turned sharply. We can't involve more authorities. She's already too scared. And what do you suggest? That we let a child wander alone through the city? Alaric closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to think. She's not wandering. Aimlessly, she lived on the streets, she knows places, people. That's when an important detail hit his memory, something Liv had mentioned during breakfast. The baker, he exclaimed. She talked about a baker who helped her and her mother, gave them stale bread. And how are we going to find a specific bakery in Manhattan? Irene asked skeptically. She said it was near where they used to sleep, near a church. Alaric frowned, trying to remember more details. Maria, the clothes that Liv was wearing when she arrived, where are they? The housekeeper ran to get them. When she returned, with the dirty and torn dress, Alaric began to examine the pockets frantically. What are you looking for? Irene watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Anything, a receipt, a piece of paper. His hands trembled as he rummaged through the thin fabric. That's when his fingers touched something in the lining of the dress, a small tear where something had been hidden. Carefully, he pulled out a piece of paper folded several times. It was a holy card of those distributed in churches with the image of Our Lady. On the back, an address, Church of Our Lady of Consolation. It's downtown, he said, already heading for the door. Near where I found her. Mr. Ventura, wait. Irene followed him down the hallway. The police are arriving for the search. If you leave now... Let them take everything, he replied without stopping. Documents, computers, whatever they want. None of that matters anymore. Descending the stairs, he found Robert in the entrance hall, surrounded by police officers with a warrant in their hands. Alaric, you can't leave. We need to manage this. No, Robert. Enough managing, hiding, trying to control everything. My granddaughter is out there, alone and scared. And this time, he grabbed the car keys. This time I won't fail her. The police officers made a move to stop him, but Irene intervened. He's with me, she declared with authority. We're searching for a minor at risk. You gentlemen can conduct your search, but we need to go now. In the car, Alaric drove with an anxiety that he could barely control. Each red light seemed to last an eternity. Each street they passed without a sign of Liv increased his despair. Turn right, Irene directed, consulting the GPS on her cell phone. The church should be right after that square. Downtown Manhattan was already swarming with its characteristic hustle and bustle. People hurrying on the sidewalks, vendors selling coffee, executives rushing to meetings. No one paid attention to a small, scared girl. When they finally spotted the church, Alaric felt his heart skip a beat. The old building stood imposingly, its Gothic towers pointing to the sky like accusing fingers. There, Irene pointed to a bakery across the street. That must be it. Alaric parked haphazardly and practically ran to the establishment. The smell of fresh bread hit him as soon as he opened the door, along with the soft ringing of the bell. An elderly man, wearing a white apron stained with flour, looked at him curiously. "Can I help you?" "Please." Alaric tried to catch his breath. "I'm looking for a girl. Small, dark hair. She used to come here with her mother." The baker's face changed immediately. "Little Liv, Luana's daughter." "Yes. Did she come by here today?" The man hesitated, his eyes studying Alaric with suspicion. "Who are you?" Alaric swallowed hard. "I'm her grandfather. Please, I need to find her." "Grandfather?" The baker frowned. "Luana never mentioned—" "It's a long story," Irene intervened, showing her identification. "But it's true, and the girl may be in danger." The baker seemed to consider for a moment, then sighed. "She did come by here about 20 minutes ago. She was crying a lot. I asked her to stay, but she said she needed to go to a special place. the last place where she saw her mother. Alaric felt the blood run cold in his veins. Where? At the city hospital. It's where Luana... The baker didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Without waiting for further explanations, Alaric ran back to the car. The hospital was only a few blocks away, he knew. How many times had he passed by it in his luxury car without imagining that his own daughter had died there? On the way, Irene made calls, alerting the authorities to Liv's possible whereabouts, but Alaric barely heard. In his mind, he saw Liv, small, scared, carrying a weight too great for her small shoulders. When they arrived at the hospital, the typical bustle of a busy morning made the search even more difficult. Doctors, nurses, patients, and companions circulated through the endless hallways. "Where do we start?" asked Irene, clearly overwhelmed by the task of finding a child in that maze. That's when Alaric saw, thrown in a corner of the hallway, almost hidden under a chair, Heloise's handkerchief. His heart stopped for a moment as he recognized the embroidered initials, now almost erased by time. "This way." He picked up the handkerchief, following the hallway. "She left this as a clue. She wants to be found." At the end of the hallway, a door led to a small chapel. It was a simple space with a few wooden benches and a cross on the wall. And there, curled up on the last bench, was Liv. Alaric felt his legs weaken when he saw her. He wanted to run to her, hug her, make sure everything would be all right, but something stopped him. The soft sound of her voice, praying softly. "Mom, I wish you were here so much. To tell me what to do, if he's telling the truth, if he really didn't know about us." The tears that Alaric had been holding back since he discovered Liv's disappearance finally began to fall. The silence of the small chapel seemed to amplify each of Liv's contained sobs. Alaric remained standing at the entrance, Heloise's handkerchief clutched in his trembling hands as he listened to his granddaughter talk to the mother who had passed away. "Maria is good to me, Mom." Liv continued her monologue without realizing the adult's presence. "She gave me clean clothes and made a tasty soup, just like the one you made when you got some vegetables at the market." Irene made a move to approach, but Alaric stopped her with a gesture. Something told him he needed to let Liv let out everything she was feeling. "And he... Grandpa..." Her voice faltered a little. "He's not angry like you said. He doesn't yell. He doesn't drink like the man in the square. He even hugged me when I was scared." She sniffled, wiping her nose on the sleeve of the dress. "But then the guy said that he knew about us all along, that he didn't want to help. And I got so angry, Mom. So angry." Alaric felt his heart. It break as he heard the pain in her voice. He took a step forward, and the old wood of the floor creaked under his feet. Liv turned around startled, her red eyes widening as she saw him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The little girl who had lost everything, and the man who had discovered too late that he had a family. "How did you find me?" she asked finally, her small voice echoing in the empty chapel. "I followed my heart," he replied, showing the handkerchief. "And a little help from Grandma Heloise." Liv looked at the handkerchief, then back at him. "Is it true that you didn't know about us? That the bad guy is lying?" Alaric walked slowly to the bench where she was, maintaining a respectful distance. "Can I tell you a story about your grandmother Eloise and about how I was very foolish a long time ago?" After a moment of hesitation, Liv nodded slightly. "I was young and scared," he began, his soft voice filling the sacred space. "I had just started my company. I was desperate to prove that I could be someone in life. Your great-grandfather, my father, was a very hard man. He drank a lot and hurt my mother." "Like the bad men on the street?" Liv asked softly. "Yes, like them. I promised myself that I would be different, that I would never be like him. But he sighed heavily. Sometimes, when we try too hard not to be like someone, we end up making other mistakes. What kind of mistakes? I trusted the wrong people. I did wrong things to get contracts to make my company grow. And when I met your grandmother, Heloise, he smiled sadly. She was so beautiful, so special. She worked hard, always with a smile on her face. Mom had a picture of her, Liv commented. She smiled like Mom. Yes, they were very similar. But I was so worried about my company, about what others were going to think. And then my father appeared with some medical exams, saying that I couldn't have children, that Heloise was only with me for money. And you believed him? There was a note of accusation in Liv's voice. I believed him. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Alaric felt tears streaming down his face. I let your grandmother go without knowing that she was expecting a baby. Your mother, Luana. If I had been braver, if I had talked to her, we could have been a family. Liv's voice was almost a whisper. Yes, honey, the best family in the world. He finally found the courage to look directly into her eyes. I know that I can't change the past. I can't bring your mother or your grandmother back, but I promise on everything that is sacred that I didn't know about you, and that now that I've found you, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for all the lost time. Liv was silent for a long moment, as if processing everything she had heard. Outside, the sounds of the hospital continued. Voices, hurried steps, occasional sirens. But inside the chapel, time seemed to have stopped. You know what Mom always told me, she said finally, playing with the hem of the dress. That we don't choose the family we're born into, but we can choose the family we want to have. She was very wise, your mother. Yes, she was. Liv sniffled again. She also said that everyone deserves a second chance, even the bad men on the street when they really apologized. Alaric felt his heart race. And you think I deserve a second chance? In response, Liv did something that caught everyone by surprise, including Irene, who was watching the scene from the entrance of the chapel. The girl stood up, walked to Alaric, and with a seriousness that seemed beyond her years, held out her hand. Do you promise that you'll never lie again, that you won't be like the bad men? Alaric took her small hand in his, feeling how cold and trembling it was. I promise. For you, for your mother, for your grandmother, I promise to be the man you have always deserved to have in your life. It was then that Liv did something even more surprising. She threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest and starting to cry. But it wasn't a cry of fear or sadness like before. It was a cry of relief, of liberation. Alaric hugged her tightly, his own tears wetting her hair. At that moment, under the silent gaze of the cross on the wall, and the memories of Luana and Heloise, grandfather and granddaughter, began to heal wounds that had crossed generations. Let's go home, he asked softly when her sobs began to subside. Liv raised her face, her eyes still bright with tears, but now with a small smile. Is Maria going to make more of that soup? Alaric laughed, feeling as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. She'll make all the soups you want. But as they got up to leave, Irene cleared her throat delicately, reminding them of her presence. Her normally stern face was more gentle, but still maintained her professional seriousness. We still have a lot to resolve, she said. The police, at the mansion, Tony's accusations. I know, Alaric replied, still holding Liv close to him, and I'm going to face it all. But now I know exactly what I'm fighting for. Liv squeezed his hand as if sealing a silent pact between them. Together they walked out of the chapel, leaving behind the weight of long-kept secrets. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time there was hope in both their hearts. However, they barely knew that Tony Barbieri had one more card up his sleeve, one that could destroy this fragile happiness they had just achieved. The return to the mansion was like entering a war zone. Police cars were still parked in front, and a small crowd of reporters huddled at the gates, their cameras pointed like weapons. Alaric instinctively pulled Liv closer, protecting her from the flashes. Maria was waiting for them at the door, her face marked by worry. "Sir, they took everything. Computers, documents, even old photographs." "It's okay, Maria," Alaric replied, guiding Liv inside. "There's nothing in those files that I need to hide now." But as soon as they entered the room, they realized that something was wrong. Robert was sitting on the sofa, his face as pale as paper, holding a brown envelope. "What is it?" Alaric asked, feeling his heart clench. "Tony was here," Robert replied, his voice trembling slightly. "After the police left, he left this." Irene, who had entered right behind them, took the envelope before Alaric could reach it. "As the social worker responsible for the case, I need to verify any material that may affect Liv's well-being." She opened the envelope with professional care, but her face changed as she examined its contents. There were old photographs, yellowed, documents, and a letter dated more than 20 years ago. "What is it?" Alaric asked, his voice barely disguising his fear. They're records from the hospital where Heloise had Luana's prenatal care," Irene replied, leafing through the papers. "And there's a letter addressed to you." Liv, who had been quiet until then, approached curiously. "Is it from Grandma Heloise?" "No," Irene frowned. "It's from your father, Mr. Ventura." Alaric felt his legs weaken. He needed to lean on the arm of the sofa to avoid falling. "Impossible. My father died 15 years ago." "The letter is old," Irene continued. "Dated a few months after you and Heloise separated. He confesses here that he knew about the pregnancy." The silence that followed was deafening. Alaric extended his trembling hand, and Irene passed him the letter. His father's irregular handwriting, stained in some places by what appeared to be drops of alcohol, was still perfectly legible. "Son, when you read this, it will probably be too late. Heloise tried to contact you several times to tell you about the baby. I stopped her. I falsified the exams that proved your infertility. I paid the doctor to confirm the lie. I couldn't let any construction worker destroy everything we built. The construction company was starting to grow. We had important contracts at stake. A bastard child with an employee would be our ruin. She threatened to tell everything, so I transferred her to a construction site in the countryside. I gave her money to disappear. It wasn't much. People like her don't know how to negotiate. I write this drunk, as always. Maybe it's the guilt. Or maybe I just want to get revenge on you, who are getting rich and powerful, while I languish in this empty house. Your mother died, hating me. Now you have a daughter out there who will grow up hating you too. This is my legacy for you, son. The same hell I lived." Alaric let the letter fall, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Long repressed memories returned like a whirlwind, his father drinking more and more in the last years of his life, murmuring incomprehensible things about regrets and secrets. "He knew," Alaric whispered, his voice choked. "All this time he knew. And now everyone will know." Tony's voice came from the door of the room. No one had heard him enter. "I've already sent copies of this letter to all the major newspapers in the city." Liv hid behind Alaric, grabbing his leg tightly. Maria took a step forward, as if wanting to protect everyone, but Tony raised his hand, showing a cell phone. "Don't worry. I didn't come to create confusion. I just wanted to see the face of the great Alaric Ventura when he discovered that he's just like his father, a man who abandons his own daughter for money and power." "You don't know anything," Alaric replied, his voice trembling with contained anger. "Don't I?" Tony smiled, a cold and calculating smile. "I know that you kept records of all the dirty schemes of the construction company. I know that you discovered my little scams and blackmailed me with it. But do you know what your mistake was? Thinking that I didn't have my own records. He took another envelope from his jacket. Here are more interesting things about how you continued your father's dirty business even after you got rich, how you used privileged information to crush competitors. How enough! Liv's shout surprised everyone. The girl came out from behind Alaric, her small fists clenched. Stop hurting my grandpa. Tony seemed disconcerted for a moment, but soon recovered his malicious smile. Look at that. The little beggar defending the millionaire grandpa. How touching. But do you know what's even more touching? How he's going to spend the next few years in jail while you go back to the place where you should never have left. The street. It was too much for Alaric. Something inside him, some barrier that had kept him controlled all these years, simply broke. He advanced towards Tony, decades of repressed anger exploding at once. But before he could reach him, a voice cut through the air like a razor. "Police! Everyone freeze!" In the doorway, behind Tony, were two investigators, and with them was a figure that made everyone's blood run cold. Clara Duarte, the most feared prosecutor in the district attorney's office. "Very well, Mr. Barbieri," she said, as the investigators collected the envelopes from Tony's hands. "I think this concludes our operation." "Daku." "What?" Tony stammered, his face losing all color. "For weeks we were monitoring your activities," Clara continued, her tone professional and cutting. "You weren't very discreet in your attempts at extortion, especially when you started contacting journalists." Irene took a step forward. "Ms. Prosecutor, as the social worker responsible for this case, I need to understand." "Of course," Clara interrupted her gently. "In fact, your presence is very opportune, because what we discovered will completely change the story of little Liv." All eyes turned to the prosecutor, who took a file from her folder. "Mr. Ventura," she addressed Alaric, "you're not the only one your father deceived, and you're not the only one who has a letter to read today." The silence in the room was so dense, it felt like it had its own weight. Clara Duarte opened the file with studied calm, while the investigators kept Tony under surveillance. The man who minutes before overflowed with arrogance now seemed to wither every second. "This letter," Clara began, "was found in a safe deposit box at the bank, along with other documents that your father kept stored. The safe was only to be opened 25 years after his death. Apparently, he wanted to ensure that his last secrets remained buried for as long as possible." Alaric felt Liv squeeze his hand tightly. The girl, who had shown so much courage moments before, now seemed frightened by the tension in the room. "The letter is addressed to Heloise," Clara continued, "but it was never delivered. I will only read the part relevant to this moment." She cleared her throat softly and began to read. "Eloise, when you receive this letter, if you ever do, I will be long dead. The cancer is progressing, and the drinking doesn't help. Not that I deserve help. The money I gave you to disappear didn't come from me. It came from Alaric himself, through an account I created in his name without him knowing. I used forged documents, forged signatures, the same method I used to falsify the fertility tests. But there is something you need to know. Something I discovered later when it was too late. Alaric also had a daughter before you, with a young woman he met in college. I found her when she was pregnant and did the same thing I did with you. I paid her to disappear. She died in childbirth, and the baby was put up for adoption. That girl grew up, became a woman, and by an irony of fate ended up working on one of our construction sites years later. Her name was Helen Campos. Yes, the same Helen who worked with you, the same one you considered your friend, your daughter. Luana and Helen's daughter are sisters, half-sisters. Alaric's blood runs in the veins of both, although neither of them ever knew it. I kept this secret for years, watching from afar these lives that I helped destroy. Remorse gnawed at me more than cancer. But now, near the end, I need to record the truth. May God forgive me if there is forgiveness for someone like me. When Clara finished reading, the silence in the room seemed even heavier. Alaric had sat down, his legs no longer, supporting the weight of the revelations. Helen Campos, he remembered her vaguely. A quiet, efficient employee who worked at the construction company for a few years before disappearing without explanation. No, it can't be true, he murmured. But it is, Clara replied, taking more documents from the file. We did all the necessary DNA tests before bringing this information. Helen Campos was your daughter, Mr. Ventura, and she had a daughter too, before passing away in a work accident at one of your construction sites. What? What happened to that child? Alaric's voice barely rose above a whisper. Clara looked at Irene, who seemed to have understood something important. The social worker took a step forward, her normally stern face now softened by an unexpected compassion. I knew her, she said. She was a sweet, intelligent girl. She was adopted by a good family. Today, she is a social worker, like me. Alaric raised his head sharply, his eyes widening with comprehension. Irene nodded slightly, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. Yes, Mr. Ventura, I'm your granddaughter, Helen's daughter. Liv, who had followed the entire conversation in silence, let go of Alaric's hand and took a step towards Irene. So, you're my aunt? The word hung in the air like a soap bubble, fragile and iridescent. Irene knelt down to get to Liv's level, her professionalism finally yielding to the emotion of the moment. Yes, honey, and now I understand why I felt such a strong connection with you from the first moment. Tony, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of confusion and frustration, tried to take a step towards the door, but the investigators stopped him. Not so fast, Mr. Barbieri, said Clara. We still have a lot to discuss about your attempts at extortion and forgery of documents. This is ridiculous, he exploded. You have no proof. Don't we? Clara smiled, a cold and professional smile. You weren't very careful in your banking transactions or in your phone conversations. As Tony was led away by the investigators, protesting and threatening, Alaric remained seated, his world spinning on a completely new axis. 2 daughters, 2 granddaughters, an entire family that he never knew he had, scattered by the cruel winds of fate and the wrong choices of his father. Why, he began, his voice faltering. Why didn't you look for me before, Irene? She stood up, still holding Liv's hand. I didn't know. I was adopted as a baby. I only found out about Helen, my biological mother, when I started working in social services, and even then I never thought there could be a connection with you. Maria, who had remained silent watching everything, suddenly exclaimed, The photographs! That's why you always seemed familiar to me. You look a lot like Miss Helen. Irene smiled sadly. They say she looked a lot like her father. Alaric raised, his eyes finding in Irene's face features that he now recognized, the same determined eyes, the same stubborn chin that he saw in the mirror every morning. I'm sorry, he said, his voice choked. For everything, for not being there, for not looking harder, for... You didn't know, Irene interrupted him gently. None of us knew. Your father wove such a complex web of lies that it took us decades to start unraveling it. That's when Liv, with the direct simplicity of children, asked the question that hung in the air. And now, what's going to happen to us? Clara, who had remained silent watching the family reunion, took a step forward. That, she said, depends on the choices you make from now on. The weeks that followed the revelations were a roller coaster of emotions and changes. The Ventura mansion, once a monument to loneliness, now seethed with a different energy. Maria had transformed the old guest room into a true princess room for Liv, with walls in soft shades of pink and a growing collection of children's books. Irene, after much reluctance and insistence from Alaric, agreed to move into the room next door. Only temporarily, she emphasized always, until we resolve the whole legal situation. But Alaric noticed how her eyes softened when Liv called her auntie, how her carefully constructed professionalism began to give way to the warmth of newfound family ties. On one particularly meaningful morning, Alaric was in his office, now considerably emptier after the police seized documents, when Irene entered with a serious expression. "We need to talk," she said, sitting down in the chair in front of his desk. "About the future." Alaric felt his heart clench. Even with all the revelations, even with the confirmed kinship, he knew that the threat of losing Liv still hung over his head. "The documents we found in your father's safe deposit box," Irene continued, "changed a lot. But there are still legal issues to be resolved." "I know," he replied, running his hands over his tired face. "The allegations of corruption, they're not as serious as they initially seemed," she interrupted him. "Prosecutor Clara found evidence that most of the irregularities were, in fact, the work of your father, using forged documents with your signature. But still, I participated in schemes in the early days of the construction company." "Yes, and you will have to answer for that." Irene adjusted her glasses, a gesture that Alaric now recognized as hereditary. His own mother used to do the same. "But the most important thing now is Liv." As if summoned by the mention of her name, the girl appeared at the office door, carrying a drawing. In recent weeks, she had developed the habit of drawing her new family, always including not only Alaric and Irene, but also Maria, and frequently portraying Luana and Eloise as angels in heaven. "Can I show Grandpa something?" she asked timidly. "Of course, honey," Irene smiled, signaling for her to come in. "In fact, it's good that you're here. We need to talk about something important." Liv approached, climbing onto Alaric's lap with a naturalness that weeks before would have been unthinkable. She showed her most recent drawing. This time she had added a new figure. "It's Grandma Helen," she explained, pointing to a dark-haired woman next to the angel that represented Luana. "Auntie Irene told me what she was like." Alaric felt tears in his eyes as he saw how his granddaughter had represented his two daughters, together, united in heaven, as they could never be on earth. Irene also seemed moved, but maintained her professional composure. "Liv," she began softly, "you know that soon we'll have an important hearing, right? To officially decide who you're going to live with." The girl squeezed the drawing against her chest, her eyes immediately filling with fear. "I don't want to leave. I promised Mom that I would take care of Grandpa." "No one is going to take you away, my love." Alaric hugged her instinctively. "I promised I wouldn't let them, remember?" "Actually," Irene cleared her throat, "that's what we need to talk about, as the social worker on the case and, well, as an interested party now, I made a special recommendation to the judge." She took a document from her folder and placed it on the table. Alaric recognized the court letterhead. "It's a request for joint custody," she explained. "Between you and me, legally it makes sense. We are Liv's closest relatives, and my position as a social worker adds an extra layer of security in the eyes of the court." "Joint custody?" Liv frowned, the word clearly new to her. "It means you would officially have two guardians," Irene explained patiently. "Your grandfather and I working together to take care of you." "Like a real family?" The girl's eyes lit up. "Yes, honey, like a real family." Alaric took the document with trembling hands, reading each word carefully. It was a chance, not only to keep Liv, but to start to correct the mistakes of the past, to give his newfound family the stability that had always been denied to them. There's one more thing, Irene continued, taking another paper from this folder. Prosecutor Clara suggested a solution to the issue of the construction company. What solution? A complete restructuring, turning the company into a foundation focused on social and housing projects. All profits would be directed to helping families in vulnerable situations like... She hesitated for a moment. Like Luana and Liv were. Alaric felt something warm and expansive grow in his chest, a mixture of pride, hope, and possibility. The foundation could also have a special program, Irene continued, her voice softer, to help orphaned children find their biological families so that no other Helen grows up without knowing her origins. Liv, who had listened to everything attentively, suddenly straightened up in her grandfather's lap. Can I help? Can I draw? For other kids who are alone like I was. It was too much for Alaric. The tears he had been holding back finally began to fall. Here was his granddaughter, who had known the cruelest face of life on the streets, thinking about how to help others who were still there. Of course you can, my love, he managed to say through tears. In fact, I think you should be the first. Artistic director of the foundation. Liv's smile lit up the entire room. She turned to Irene, her eyes shining with excitement. Auntie, are you going to stay here with us forever? Irene, who for weeks had maintained a careful professional distance, finally allowed her own tears to fall. If your grandfather agrees, she replied softly, I think it's time for this family to be together. Maria chose exactly this moment to appear at the door, carrying a tray with hot chocolate and cookies, a new ritual she had established for Liv's afternoons. Love is like hot chocolate, she said, with the simple wisdom that had always characterized her. It gets better when there are more people to share it with. That afternoon, as the newly formed family shared cookies and stories, something began to change in the old Ventura mansion. The silence that for so long had filled its hallways began to be replaced by laughter, conversations, and the promise of a different future. But there was still one last battle to be faced, the hearing that would officially decide Liv's fate. And no one could predict what fate still held for this family that was only just beginning to recognize itself as such. The day of the hearing dawned with a fine, insistent drizzle, typical of Manhattan. Alaric helped Liv get dressed in the new outfit that Maria had bought especially for the occasion, a navy blue dress with small embroidered flowers and a white ribbon in her hair. Are you nervous? He asked gently, watching how she kept smoothing the skirt of the dress. A little bit, she admitted. What if the judge doesn't like me? Impossible for anyone not to like you. Irene appeared at the door, already dressed in her most formal outfit. Besides, it's not a matter of liking or not. It's a matter of doing what's best for you. Liv nodded, but Alaric could see that she was still apprehensive. In recent weeks, she had become accustomed to her new life, with the decorated room, the regular meals, the bedtime stories. The idea that all of this could be taken away from her suddenly was terrifying. In the car, on the way to the courthouse, the silence was heavy. Maria had insisted on going along. To give strength, she said, although everyone knew that she herself needed to be there to make sure that her little family would not be separated. At the entrance of the imposing courthouse building, they found Clara Duarte waiting for them. The prosecutor, normally so stern, offered a gentle smile to Liv. "Ready?" she asked. Liv squeezed Alaric's hand tighter and nodded bravely. Together, they climbed the marble steps towards the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was solemn and intimidating. Judge Mendez, a middle-aged man with grey hair and a serious expression, was already in his place. Next to him, a considerable pile of documents, the entire history of the Ventura family reduced to official papers. "Before we begin," said the judge, adjusting his glasses, "I would like to establish that this is not a common hearing. We have here a peculiar situation. He picked up one of the documents. A social worker who discovers she is the granddaughter of the man whose case she is following. A child who lived on the streets and who, through a series of coincidences or destiny, for the more romantic, finds her grandfather. And a businessman who discovers not just one, but two daughters he never knew he had. Alaric felt his heart race. Put that way, the whole situation seemed even more surreal. "Mr. Ventura," the judge addressed him directly, "are you aware that you are still facing proceedings for irregularities in your company?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alaric replied firmly, "and I am prepared to bear all the consequences of my actions. But I ask that this not interfere with the decision regarding Liv." "I understand," the judge made a note. "And you, Dr. Irene, as a social worker, do you see a conflict of interest in your current position?" Irene stood up, her glasses gleaming under the fluorescent light. "Your Honor, when I took on this case, I had no idea of the family connection, but now that the truth has come to light, I believe that my professional experience, combined with the family bond, only strengthens my ability to ensure Liv's well-being." The judge nodded slowly, then his gaze turned to the girl, who until then remained quiet, holding Alaric's hand. "Liv," he called, his voice softening considerably. "Could you come here, please?" With a last look at Alaric, who nodded encouragingly, Liv walked to the front of the room. Her new dress rustled softly with each step. "How old are you, Liv?" "6, she replied, her voice small but clear. "And do you understand why we are all here today?" Liv thought for a moment, then answered with a sincerity that touched everyone in the room. "To decide if I can stay with my family, my real family." "And who is your real family?" "Grandpa Alaric," she began to count on her fingers. "Auntie Irene, who is also my family by blood, Maria, who takes care of us." She paused, looking up. "And Mom, and Grandma Heloise, and Grandma Helen, who are in heaven looking out for us." The judge leaned slightly forward. "And are you happy with them?" "Very," Liv smiled, a smile that lit up the whole room. "Grandpa reads me stories every night, and Auntie Irene helps me with the letters, and Maria makes the best soup in the world. And—" She hesitated for a moment. "And?" the judge prompted. "And they never look at me the way other people looked when I was on the street. You know? As if I didn't exist." A heavy silence fell over the room. Maria discreetly wiped away tears with her handkerchief. Clara Duarte, the prosecutor, cleared her throat to disguise her own emotion. "There's one more thing, Your Honor," Liv continued, surprising everyone by pulling a folded paper from her dress pocket. "Can I show you?" The judge nodded, and she carefully unfolded the paper. It was one of her drawings. In it, her entire family was represented, including the little angels in heaven, as she called her mother and grandmothers. "Mum always said that family is like a drawing," she explained, showing the figure to the judge. "It doesn't matter if it's a little crooked or if the colors don't match right. What matters is the love that we put into it." The judge examined the drawing for a long moment, his normally stern face softening visibly. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. "You know, Liv," he said, returning the drawing, "in all my years as a judge, I have never seen such a good explanation of what a family really is." He leaned back in his chair, looking at everyone present. "I have here several reports, psychological, evaluations, social assessments, but nothing speaks louder than what we have just seen and heard." Clara Duarte stood up. "Your Honor, the District Attorney's Office fully supports the request for joint custody. We believe that—" But the judge interrupted her gently. "It won't be necessary, Doctor. My decision has already been made." He took his pen and began to sign some documents. Joint custody is granted to Mr. Alaric Ventura and Dr. Irene Dwyer, with quarterly monitoring by Child Protective Services for the first 2 years. Liv, who had returned to Alaric, squeezed his hand tightly. "Does that mean I can stay?" "Yes, my love," Irene replied, her voice choked. "You can stay." Maria could no longer contain the tears, hugging Liv tightly. Clara Duarte smiled, satisfied, with the outcome of the case that had changed her own vision of family and justice. But the judge had not finished. "However," he continued, his tone becoming serious again, "we still have the issue of the construction company and the allegations of corruption to resolve." Alaric's heart skipped a beat. It was the moment he feared most, the possibility of being separated from Liv because of his past mistakes. What he did not know was that fate still had one last surprise reserved for that family that was only just beginning to recognize itself as such. Judge Mendez leafed through a few more documents before continuing. The silence in the room was almost palpable, broken only by the soft sound of Maria's contained crying. "Mr. Ventura," he began, "your proposal to transform the construction company into a social foundation is commendable, but we need to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Alaric replied, his voice firm despite the fear he felt. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I have determined some conditions. First, the foundation will be managed by an independent board, in which you may participate, but not as president." He paused, observing Alaric's reaction, who only nodded in agreement. "Second, 30% of the profits will be allocated to a special fund for locating and assisting children in street situations. And third," he looked directly at Liv, "the foundation will have a special art therapy program for children, coordinated by a young and talented artist." Liv's eyes widened. "Can I really help other children?" "You can," the judge smiled. "In fact, we already have our first case." He signaled, and a social worker who was at the back of the room approached, leading by the hand a boy of approximately 8 years old. He was clean and well-dressed, but his eyes carried that same look that Liv had when she arrived at the mansion, the look of someone who had known the difficulties of life too early. "This is Miguel," the judge introduced. "He also lived on the streets until recently, and interestingly, his story has more in common with yours than we imagine, Liv." Clara Duarte stood up, holding a new set of documents. "When we started investigating the Ventura family case, we found other similar stories. Miguel is the son of one of the employees of the old construction company, a young woman named Carolina who worked there about 9 years ago." Alaric felt his heart skip a beat. "Carolina? Carolina Silva?" "Yes, Clara." "Confirmed. Did you know her?" She worked in administration," Alaric replied, his voice trembling slightly. "She was very efficient, but one day she simply disappeared. We never knew." "She was pregnant," Clara completed softly. "And just like Heloise and Helen, she was also removed by someone who wanted to keep secrets buried." "Tony," Alaric murmured, the comprehension hitting him like lightning. "He was the administrative manager at the time." "Exactly," Clara nodded. "He maintained his father's scheme, even after he passed away. He continued to identify employees in vulnerable situations and remove them when they became pregnant. Carolina was one of them. Miguel, who had remained silent until then, took a small step forward. "My mom died last year," he said, his voice small but clear. "She always said that my dad was a good man, but that bad people didn't let her tell him the truth." Alaric felt his legs weaken. He needed to lean on the table to avoid falling. Another son, another life that he didn't know existed. Liv, demonstrating a sensitivity beyond her years, let go of Alaric's hand and walked to Miguel. "Does that mean you're my uncle?" The boy looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" "Well," Liv began to explain in the simple and direct way. Of children, if Grandpa Alaric is your dad and he's my grandpa, then you're my uncle, and now you have a family too. A single tear rolled down Miguel's face. Alaric could no longer contain himself. He walked to the son he didn't know and knelt in front of him. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice choked. "If I had known, if someone had told me." To his surprise, it was Miguel who took the first step, throwing his thin arms around his neck. "Mom always said it wasn't your fault," he sobbed. "That one day we would meet and you would understand." Irene, who was watching the scene with tears in her eyes, approached. "Your Honor, as the social worker on the case and, well, as part of this family now, I would like to request—" "Miguel's custody will also be shared," the judge interrupted her with a gentle smile. "Everything is already arranged. After all, we can't separate a family that took so long to find each other, can we?" Maria, who couldn't stop crying, was already making plans aloud. "I'm going to prepare the room next to Liv's. He needs to gain more weight. I'm going to make all the food he likes. And I can teach him how to draw," Liv exclaimed, taking Miguel's hand. "Did you know that drawing helps when we're sad? Auntie Irene taught me." As the children began to talk, Alaric found himself surrounded by his family. Irene, his granddaughter who grew up without knowing him, but who fate brought back through her work. Maria, who had no blood ties, but had all the love in the world to give. And now Miguel, the son he didn't know existed, bringing with him another story of pain, but also of hope. Judge Mendez watched everything with a discreet smile. In his many years of career, he had seen families being destroyed by lies and secrets. It was comforting for a change to see a family being rebuilt by the truth. "As for the accusations of corruption," he said finally, "considering all the evidence and your clear willingness to make amends for the mistakes of the past, I determined that you serve 3 years of community service, personally supervising the social projects of the new foundation." Alaric nodded, feeling a huge weight lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't just a punishment, it was an opportunity to really make a difference, to transform the empire built on lies into something that could help other families. "And there's one more thing." Clara approached, holding one last envelope. "We found this among Luana's belongings. Apparently she wrote letters to Liv for years, telling the true story of the family. She wanted her daughter to know the truth when she was older." Liv took the envelope with reverent care, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "Can I read it now?" "How about we read them together?" Alaric suggested. "At home, with a cup of Maria's hot chocolate." "And cookies," Miguel added timidly, making everyone smile. As they left the courthouse, now as a family officially recognized by law, Alaric couldn't help but think about how life goes around. Years of lies and secrets had created deep wounds, separated people who should be together. But there they were, finding their way back to each other. On the sidewalk, Liv stopped suddenly and looked at the sky, where the sun began to break through. The drizzle that had fallen throughout the morning. "Look, Grandpa!" She pointed to a rainbow that was forming. "Mom always said that rainbows are a sign of a promise fulfilled." "What promise, honey?" he asked, moved. "The promise that one day we wouldn't be alone anymore," she replied simply, taking his hand. "And now we're not." Miguel, still shy but already feeling part of that peculiar family, took Liv's other hand. Irene and Maria came right behind, talking about the changes they would need to make in the house to accommodate one more member. And so, under the rainbow that seemed to bless that new beginning, the Ventura family returned home. Not to the cold and silent mansion of before, but to a true home, where love had finally found space to flourish. The lies of the past had been replaced by the truth. Loneliness had given way to belonging, and most importantly, none of them would ever have to walk alone again. Because now they knew family is not just a matter of blood or official papers. It's about love, forgiveness, and the courage to start over. It's about finding your place in the world, even if that place takes years to reveal itself. And sometimes, as Leave had said, it's exactly like a drawing. It may not be perfect, it may have its colors out of place, but it's unique and special precisely because of its imperfections.